So what's up, guys? We're here trying to get some breakfast. This is the day presentation. They ready?
Oh yeah, I'm ready. Already.
Yeah, we good. We good. We good. If y'all can only see the amount of people here, it's just like packed to maximum capacity.
This is dope. This is very dope. I feel like it's so late. No? Yeah, it is.
I love the title of this conference, The Dream Deferred. I love that you have the HBCUs and counselors. I understand there are counselors here from high schools. So what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up in the sun, or does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? In 1951, a Lincoln University, Lincoln University folks in here? Or two. All right, all two of them. I love that yell. Great job. A Lincoln University alum by the name of Langston Hughes published Harlem, included in the montage of A Dream Deferred in 1951, caused all Americans during that time to reflect on the inequalities, the injustices, discrimination, the inequities that prevented African Americans from achieving the American dream. He wrote this only 3 years before the seminal Supreme Court decision in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, that declared state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students to be unconstitutional. His basic premise was that African Americans cannot dream or aspire to great things if they are in an oppressive environment. If they're an environment that stifles creativity, hope, aspirations, and intellectual thought. I ask that you fast forward to 2018 and I challenge each of you today, while you're going to all of your sessions throughout this conference, to think about the state of our youth and our college-going students in your respective areas where you come from. Here locally, I can tell you that within a 3-mile radius of my campus, we have some of the lowest performing elementary, middle, and high schools, not only in the state of Texas, but in the country, within 3 to 5 miles of my campus. The college readiness rate is about 25%. The graduation rate, however, is at 85%. I was at church, my pastor would tap the microphone to make sure it's on. There's something wrong with that, right? Close to 70% of our students are first generation, still today. Close to 70% of our students. I know Dr. Simmons can tell you on commencement day on her campus, when they asked the question, like we do at most HBCUs, about how many of you are first in your family, you still have the audience that goes right up. Many of you in here today probably asked that question, your hands would go up. I see the people back here have their hands up. 90% of my students rely on some form of financial aid. I always tell people, my students don't always drop out, they stop out. They don't always have the finances. Does that sound familiar? Right? They don't always have the finances. Let's talk nationally. Fourth grade nationally, only 19% of African American fourth graders were proficient in reading. Only 18% were proficient in math. You fast forward that for 4 years, go to the 8th grade. Only 16% of African American 8th graders were proficient in reading. Only 13% of African American 8th graders were proficient in math. The national rate for all 4th graders in reading was 36% as compared to 19%, and 40% in math as compared to 18%. Again, I challenge each of you to go back to your communities and analyze the success, the completion, and the college-going data, and ask yourselves, is the dream still being deferred from a segment of the student population that you're trying to recruit, that you're trying to retain, that you're trying to graduate? If so, the biggest question that you should be asking yourselves is, what are you doing about it? What are you doing about it at your institution? That's a challenge, to go back and find that data and have those conversations about what you should be doing about it. Just because I talked about our elementary, middle, and high schools, does not mean that Texas Southern can turn a blind eye to them. We were designated as a special purpose institution for urban programming back in 1973 in the 63rd legislative session of the state of Texas. What does that mean? It means that we have an obligation then to train the next workforce of teachers. They're going to work in urban environments through our College of Education. We have the obligation to train our next engineers. They're going to be in our College of Science and Engineering and Technology. That's our obligation. I'll end with this. I'm probably over my 10 minutes. I'll end with this. In the state of Texas today, we have a plan called 60 by 30 Texas. And folks here from Texas know what I'm talking about. And in that plan, really it's an extension. Years ago, it was closing the gaps by 2015, put out in 2000. But 60 by 30 Texas basically means or says that in 2030, a few short years, 60% of Texans will need a degree or certificate. I tell my students and audiences like this all the time, what do you think Texas is going to look like in 2030? It's going to be heavily African American and Hispanic. And I know that my institution is going to be producing those students, right, that have those degrees and certificates at a higher rate than other institutions in this state because of who we have now, who we have coming to us now. Our local independent school district is over 70–80% minority. So I think when people ask me the questions, are HBCUs still relevant or still needed? Many of you probably saw the documentary, Tell Them We Are Rising, with Stanley Nelson. I think that historical piece and then the data that you will find at some of our institutions that are thriving, not surviving, but thriving, will answer that question. I know at Texas Southern University, we are thriving, right? So tell them we are rising. On that note, I challenge you again, go back to your communities. Challenge yourselves, partner, right? Connect. And let's make sure that we can all have success so that dream is not deferred. Thank you very much for your time.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Bakari Sellers, and I am from the big city of Denmark, South Carolina. That wasn't a joke. Where we have 3 stoplights and a blinking light, and my mom and dad always taught me that the 2 most important words in the English language were the words thank you. And they're not nearly said enough. And so before I begin, I want to thank the College Board and all my panelists and all of you all here for joining us. And I think we all understand, and the panelists understand, that we have made some progress in this country, but we still have yet a ways to go. The U.S. Census Bureau reports that 87% of African Americans 25 or older have a high school diploma. African Americans receiving bachelor's degrees have tripled since 1976. However, everyone in this room knows that more black children than white children are likely to start school with gaps in school readiness. One of the things that I harp on in my part-time job on CNN is unequal discipline and expulsion rates, how they're higher for blacks than any other group of students. When we talk about the fundamental inequalities and the availability and enrollment in advanced coursework, especially for those attending school in urban areas. In addition, there are also substantial racial inequalities in identifying students for gifted services. For Black students who are matriculating at colleges and universities, the disparities in college completion rates are stark. So today, one of the things that we're going to do, and we only have 45 minutes to do it, panel, but we are going to deconstruct and analyze inequities in the educational system and move from a solely deficit-based narrative to decisions that strengthen policies and conversations that fundamentally change the state of education for African American students. So we're not going to talk over each other. This will not be like what you see on CNN most nights. I'm going to do my best Don Lemon and Anderson Cooper. And we're going to begin this new narrative by engaging this esteemed panel of educators to discuss how we can better the future for African American education. With that,
every student I can help at Prairie View to move through and to become successful, that's the work we should be doing.
Michael, you know, we first met back in Memphis, Tennessee. They brought in partners from all across the area, and I think we had about 1,500 young African American males that came out. 1,000 of them got jobs. They had me in a corner teaching kids how to tie ties. I was crying out of one eye, feeling like I'm doing something purposeful. And Michael's just been amazing with this program, but take your shot at the questions.
Yeah, sure. One, it's an honor to be here today with so many change makers gathered in this room today. Also to be sitting in between these two extraordinary women. You know, people talk about My Brother's Keeper, but there'd be no My Brother's Keeper without sisters who have had our back every step of the way and been in the leadership. So this is appropriate. I also have to bring greetings and gratitude for your work on behalf of the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama. He sends his best regards. You know,
He's welcome to come back in.
He's overseas right now. We're still doing the work. You know, it's a tough question. It's hard to wake up to the news every morning when we look at what's happening in mass incarceration, when we look at what's happening in employment, when we look at what's happening, you know, with funding of schools. You know, we were talking a little earlier about what's happening in Austin, and sometimes you think, what decade am I born into? But you know, I think there is hope. There's hope for a lot of reasons. Many of you probably saw the report on the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission. The only bright spot, I would say, in that report, looking at the Kerner Commission, was the fact that African Americans have actually begun to excel more so in high school graduation rates and college going and college completion. You know, when you look at the work that's happening around the country, we know what works, I think, probably more so than we used to. We're using data more and more to inform our decisions. In the Obama administration, we had the first ever data collection around chronic absenteeism. And so we were able to target intervention. So we're a little smarter about what we're doing. You know, I see great programs all around the country. You know, I think the challenge is, though, we've got to learn how to fall in love with the problem and not in love with the solution. And if you look at the report that came out this morning in the New York Times, you know, we're spending a lot of time on programs, we're spending a lot of time on feeling good, and not enough time on the systemic solutions that have gotten us here in the first place. And it's really easy for corporate partners and philanthropies to put their name on a project, on a program that I can get started in a year. It's a lot harder to look at the fact that we're standing here today working on these issues because of 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow and oppression, and there's systemic challenges that we have to face. All that said, I still remain hopeful. You know, my grandmother grew up in Riegelwood, North Carolina, outside of Wilmington in the segregated South. Her and her sister left in the 50s, escaping what was, you know, a segregated South, and were almost refugees in their own country. Eventually made their way up to New York. My grandmother worked at New York and then Massachusetts. My grandmother worked her whole life in factory jobs, getting all sorts of injuries to make a way up for her family. And a year ago, I was able to bring my mother and my grandmother to the Oval Office to meet the first Black president of the United States. And she cried and I cried. And so we see progress and we have to hold on that. And you know, we also, I think, have to be encouraged by our young people. I worked for the Case Foundation and we did a lot of work on social activism and how technology was going to be used for good. And around the early 00s, we were all really worried that the next generation was going to think tweeting was enough and that they weren't going to show up and show out. But look what they did in Black Lives Matter. Look what they're doing after Parkland. Our young people are stepping up and showing out in extraordinary ways, just like the generations did before them when they walked out of school and held up the signs that said, "Let my mommy and daddy vote." So we've got some challenges, but we've got a whole lot of tools and a whole lot of reasons to be positive and optimistic.
I want to highlight
serving 371,000 students. 30 years ago, Chicago was recognized as the worst public school system in the country by the then Secretary of Education. And since that time, we have made great gains, so ignore the media attention on all the negativity of Chicago, because when we really peel back the onion and look at the educational gains we've made, we are a district that is really setting a standard, and we know that we're a district that other districts are trying to learn from. For example, we were recently identified as being the AP District of the Year. One of the reasons we got that recognition was because of the performance of Black and Latino students on the AP exam. And I think that really speaks to what's really challenging in educating, in the future of educating African American youth. President of Texas Southern was correct. We do have increasing graduation rates. We see it in Chicago, we see it all over the country. We're really addressing the instructional needs, the actual academic achievement of students is a problem that has really been challenged by a lot of districts. I would argue that this really goes back to the same principles that I applied as a teacher. If we want to really solve this issue, first of all, we have to have the will. The question that I often ask a school, a principal, do you really care how students of color perform? Because if you don't, you're not going to organize your resources to support them. You'll let kids fall through the cracks. You won't care if they go to jail. You won't care if they graduate from college or not, right? Do you have the will? Does it even matter? Secondly, do you have the skill? Often people will point to kids from a deficit model and say, well, their families are very poor and the kids don't do their homework. And then when we look at actually what's happening in the classroom or in the school or in the district, we see a lot of gaps that adults have. And I think one thing, and it's important to acknowledge it because you can solve for it as opposed to always blaming students, right? So do we have the will? Do we have the skill? Do we have the resources? That's not only fiscal resources, but also professional resources. One way we were able to be successful in Chicago, we had professional learning communities of teachers coming together to share best practices. We took advantage of the opportunities for teachers to receive professional development. We ensured that kids had books, which might sound crazy, but sometimes kids don't have books. And so when kids don't have books, they won't learn how to read, right? And then finally, what is the accountability? In Chicago, I will say this, Arne Duncan, the former Secretary of Education, really pushed us along this path. Our current CEO continues to do that. Schools were held accountable for the performance of students, not only overall students, but also students in those priority groups. How are African American students performing? You're going to be held accountable for that. How are Latino students performing? You're going to be held accountable for that. We've continued along that path of being very specific and targeted and knowing when the laundry is dirty, you got to know what's dirty, right? But then, once you know what's dirty, you can set yourself upon a path in order to get it clean and keep it clean.
Thank you for that.
And that difference doesn't mean that they are not students that can achieve. What that difference really shows is that teachers and educators have to have a lot of different approaches that they take when working with students, but also in addressing any kind of academic deficiencies that may be revealed by, tests or exams or et cetera. But not only that, ensuring teachers have that, but really making sure that within a school system, all of the processes and all the systems talk to each other so that a teacher can't just make a decision and then forever it becomes a permanent label on that student. A lot of times when we see these things happening, people are either cutting corners, they don't have enough resources, a teacher is just tired of this child that will not sit down, maybe because it's a new teacher who's really still trying to learn what classroom management is. Maybe it's because it's a teacher who hasn't been exposed to African American students. And when African American students don't act like the students that teacher went to school with, they make a lot of assumptions. It's really, and to me, like, we have to understand that we're all learners in an organization, and we have to make sure that at every level of an organization, people are continually learning and continuously being developed. But we also have to have safeguards in place to make sure that that has not happened. So in Chicago, as we looked at our numbers and we looked at our systems, we have been taking a step back to be very clear about really ensuring that if a student does have a disability and needs additional support, we do want those systems in place, but we also want a system in place, to make sure kids aren't just being labeled, but also so that they can have a way out. Because in Chicago, the vast majority of students that are labeled as students having a disability are forever labeled that way. They never exit the system, and there are a lot of life implications for that.
So Generation Z, you have millennial generation, and then you have